Patricia Walsh Chadwick, thank you so much for coming on to KMOX.
Thank you for having me.
What a fascinating story. This is kind of an unbelievable story, really. So as I start to get the background, from what I understand, and you can tell me if this was, maybe I'm getting the wrong impression, but somehow you were separated from your parents as a child, and for most of your childhood, almost up until the age of 18, you were part of a religious order cult.
Well, yes, I was, as were they. So the separation was not a separation where I never saw them. It was a separation where they were no longer allowed to be my parents.
Huh.
And instead, within this community, which had about 60 adults and 40 children, other people who were designated as angels raised the 39 children, not the parents.
So they were still involved. They kind of voluntarily came in and they brought their entire family into it, you included.
They voluntarily came in, and I was an infant at the time. I was 4 months old, and then they had 4 more children, so I was the oldest of 5.
How did they get involved in it?
It was interesting. It was the original organization was actually a very positive and constructive organization, and it was called St. Benedict Center, and it was founded as a place for Harvard and Radcliffe students who were Catholic to meet and discuss religion, philosophy, and a social engagement. And my parents both came to it under those auspices. My father was getting his graduate degree at Boston College and was also a teacher there, and my mother was quite a bit younger than he and had just been converted to Catholicism. So they got there, and it was run by a woman named Catherine Clark, and she had brought in an amazing, talented, brilliant Jesuit priest named Father Leonard Feeney. Mm-hmm. And he, in fact, married my parents in 1947. And then, really shortly thereafter, the place started to have a bit of a decline based on the fact that they took a very orthodox, if that might be the right word, interpretation of a dogma of the Catholic faith, which said that in order to be saved, one had to be a Catholic. And ecumenism was just burgeoning at that time, and the Archbishop, who later became the Cardinal of Boston, Cardinal Cushing, really did not want that to be the focus.
Yeah. And
so he tried to persuade Father and my father and others who were teaching at Boston College to kind of tone that down, and they refused. So shortly after I was born, Father Leonard Feeney was deprived of his priestly functions, and then a few years later, he was actually excommunicated. My father was fired from Boston College, and then when I was 5 months old, this group came together and all signed a document forming a religious community called the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary.
Wow.
And that was what then became the nucleus of the 100-odd people that were in the community I grew up in.
Oh, wow. So part of this, too, did they keep a lot of the same Catholic beliefs, or were they coming up with their own understandings of the Bible at that point?
No, very, very much along the lines of the Catholic Church. But the interesting thing was they took this one dogma, and they would allow no other interpretation of it, and it became their cause. And the word cause was something that I, as a little 3-year-old, knew. I knew that word before I knew spaghetti, practically.
Yeah.
We had a cause, and as I grew older and older, 5, 6, 7, I used to think, why do we have to have a cause? Because it makes everyone else hate us.
It's fascinating because my wife, growing up as a Christian, knew some Catholics that were like that still. It seems like it's maybe not as mainstream as a belief anymore, but it's still things that people in the Catholic community do believe.
Yes, that is true, and some believe it rigidly, and some believe it in a much more laid-back, laissez-faire attitude, that it's really God's decision and not man's decision, or man and women's decision, to really decide who goes to heaven and who doesn't.
Yeah, ain't that the truth? Well, that's part of the Bible in general. I don't really see Jesus talking about, or even something coming, any part where it says only Catholics are going to, it's about belief in Jesus, you see. Well, what about your time as a child? And you didn't know any better. Obviously, you were brought in at a very young age. You grew up in this community. Were you completely separated from the rest of the world?
We were entirely separated from the rest of the world. In Cambridge, so we started off in Cambridge, Massachusetts, literally, in the shadow of Harvard Yard. And we were all communally living, and we built a red fence around the 7 houses where all the families lived. And so pretty soon, I couldn't even see the outside world. And then when I was 6 years old, the edict came down from Leonard Feeney and Sister Catherine that all the children who were 3 years of age and older, so in my family, I was 6, and I had a sister 5 and a brother 3, and we were all of a sudden separated from our parents, and we lived dormitory style.
Whoa.
The boys on the first floor and the girls on the second and third. And then, not long after that, Father Feeney went to my parents and asked them to take a vow of celibacy, which they absolutely refused. And he continued to pressure them and eventually told them that they were the only holdouts. And it was really a bit of chicanery because the fact of the matter was he was doing the same thing to other couples. And eventually my parents thought, you know what, if we don't do this, we'll have to leave. And we really think that our children will get the best Catholic education if we stay. And so, much to their dismay, they actually entered into a celibate life with each other.
Wow. This is after 3 children or 4?
5.
5 children. Do you have
But my mother said she wanted 12. Now, I'm not sure.
Whoa.
That's not what it meant.
How was this all funded, by the way? I mean, if you're talking about 100 or so people, were there outside jobs? Were the adults going and working?
They, in fact, were selling books. It was called Bookselling, and I can remember it from as far back as I was 2 or 3 years old. And Leonard Feeney and Sister Catherine were writing books with the help of, remember, some of these people were extremely bright and talented. And the grown-ups, the adults would get in a car, 6 women in one car, 6 men in another car. They would go to Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, and they'd be gone for a week. And when I was a very small child, they would be being arrested. And I remember my own father getting arrested one time.
Wow.
But that was the way they made their money. And eventually, when I was 9, we moved out to Harvard, Massachusetts. Very bucolic setting, bunch of Yankee territory, as opposed to an intellectual one. And then we ultimately had a couple of 100 acres and became almost completely self-sufficient. But the bookselling continued to go on, and that was the primary way that they earned money.
Wow. Well, if they went and traveled here to St. Louis, what was the name of the book?
Oh, there were so many books. Every several years, they would come up with a new book. One was called Our Glorious Popes. One was called Bread of Life. They were all books about the saints or about doctrine or religion. And because we were outside of the Catholic Church at that point, because Father Feeney had been excommunicated, sometimes the local Catholic authorities would have them arrested because they were said they're soliciting and they have books that are not sanctioned by the Catholic Church.
Wow. So was it labeled and stamped, from the cult of St. Benedict Center or anything like that? Or...
No, it did say Ravengate Press, which was the name of the press that they used. No, they did not want to identify themselves. But what it did not have was the stamp, that imprimatur, that the Catholic Church would put on any Catholic book.
Yeah.
And so it was being sold as, I'll call it renegade, but outside of the auspices of the local authorities, church authorities.
Little Sister, a memoir, and author Patricia Walsh Chadwick joining us here on KMOX. You said 9. At the age of 9, your family moved to a self-sufficient, large plot of land. Was that the first time you were away from that one campus you were living on?
Well, it was all 100 of us that moved from the Cambridge campus to the Still River campus.
Oh, you all moved all one. Wow.
The whole group of us. And we continued. We had our education within the confines of this community. As I, mentioned in the book, there was no television. I didn't listen to the radio. There were no magazines. There were no newspapers. Never went to the movies outside of our property. Never went to a supermarket. Never danced. And the boys, once we moved to Still River, and I was 9 at that time, and I was one of the oldest children, the rules became even more draconian. We were suddenly not even allowed to talk to our own parents.
Wow.
Which I found very, very difficult. And yet, through it all, my father in particular, but both of our parents, basically let us know that they loved us. So my father's responsibility, despite the fact that he was a highly intellectual man and studying philosophy and was a mathematician, he was assigned to fix the automobiles. And we had quite a few, being 100 people.
Yeah.
And so he worked right in the garage, which was right in the area I had to go by all the time. And as I would go by the car and he would be working under the hood, he would just look over at me and wiggle his little pinky finger at me, which was his way of saying hello.
Oh, wow.
And then he and I would agree on our birthdays, and we didn't celebrate birthdays. Birthdays were replaced with feast days, but his was in July and mine was in August. We would always find a way to find each other on our birthdays, and he would whisper to me, "Happy birthday, my little princess," which was what he had called me from the time I was a tiny child.
Wow. Well, let me ask you, do you have any children now?
I do. I have two.
Could you imagine not communicating with them? I know it's your parents, but how? I mean, did you ever look back and wonder how they could put you guys in a situation where they're not even allowed to communicate with you?
And I could not do it. And I did at length speak to my parents, and there was never any anger on any of the part of the five of us towards them. But they made their decisions. They were not decisions I could have made. And my parents knew I was writing this book. My mother died only 6 or 9 months ago, and she had read the whole book. And she said parts of it made her sad, for many reasons, I'm sure. But she said it's all true, and you need to publish it. So they didn't try to hide behind anything, and they were really very honest with us. They honestly felt they were doing what was best for us and were willing to sacrifice for it. But it was certainly not a sacrifice I would ever have been willing to make.
Yeah. Little Sister, a memoir. If people want to check the book out, or if they want to check you out on the web, where can they find you?
So I have a website, patriciachadwick.com. Mm-hmm. Of course, they can buy it on Amazon, but if they go to the website, it will lead you to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or other outlets, but it will also give you some other opportunities to see some podcasts or hear some podcasts as well as some videos I've done.
Wow. You know, and part of this, too, is there's a lot of photos in here. So was there people actively engaging in photography and documenting what was going on inside of the actual cult itself?
No. In fact, photographs were really banned. And my two youngest sisters, there are no photographs of them as children until, they're about 12 or 13. So we went through, we have photographs of me up till about the age of 4. And then you don't see any again until I am about 15. So there was a period in which photographs were banned, and parents were not allowed to even go to their own parents' funerals. When the adult members had members of their family that died, they weren't allowed to go and see their families. So it was really, it took me a long time. I was not willing to use the word cult, primarily because it was my home, and I didn't think of it that way. And it was my daughter, when she was in college, who said to me one time, she said, "Mom, you've just got to face the reality. You grew up in a cult." And I decided she loved me and I loved her, and there was no reason she was trying to hurt me. And I thought, you know what, I have to accept that.
Wow, this whole story is absolutely amazing. And this is only half the story. The other half is when she got kicked out. What happened? What happened between her family members, her parents? What happens when, for your entire life, you are inside of a cult and you have to all of a sudden fend for yourself in the real world? What happens then? We're going to continue our conversation with Patricia Walsh Chadwick, because none of her family went with her. She was alone. Whew. Quite a story. We'll continue it up. You can find me on Twitter at Ryan Recker. And if you want to listen to any part of the show, go to KMOX.com/overnight.
Every Sunday, Face the Nation brings you in-depth interviews with the biggest names in Washington.
Kellyanne Conway, Nancy Pelosi, Lindsey Graham, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
You'll never miss an episode with the weekly podcast from CBS News Radio. Tune in to hear moderator Margaret Brennan and the country's top policymakers discuss today's toughest issues.
What is going on? Is this political conspiracy, or is this just incompetence?
The Face the Nation podcast.
Download and subscribe at thenewradio.com app or wherever you get your podcasts.